I know it's hard to believe that because you think the way people live around you is the way everybody lives on the planet. And I thought that way too. I used to have Russian friends until February 24th, when no one from Russia messaged me to ask what's going on, how are you, how's your family? So honestly, this was extremely surprising to me. So anyone who accuses Ukrainian government of being um, authoritarian, and if they are from Canada, they need to look closer at their home country first. That's for sure.
All right, I'm really excited to share this video with you guys. I just want to give a little bit of context before we jump into the video. I hope you watch the entire thing. And first things first, really appreciate Andri just being willing to have this conversation with me, because I think it's an important conversation. I think that people need to be more open to having conversations with people they maybe don't see 100% alignment with, right? Or maybe you slightly disagree. I just want to give a couple points of perspective on this before we jump into the video. So again, I understand, and I even understand why Andri was maybe a little bit frustrated with me at times that we were so narrow focused on the Nazi narrative around what's going on in Ukraine. Now, again, for the purposes of this specific video, that was the ultimate goal. I do think that he makes a very reasonable point that, like, let's look at the bigger context of things. Let's look at why we're even having this conversation and whether that's playing into Russia's perspective or narrative. I personally still truly believe, though, that by being willing to have more open and honest conversations about these sort of things, it'll be less likely for individuals to go down rabbit holes of conspiracies. Because I think the moment that any of their trusted sources are shown to have, a strong bias or manipulate any facts, a lot of people then want to jump to hard conclusions in the opposite direction. Personally, I think that that's what I've seen in regards to, certain memes, particularly on, to a lesser extent Twitter, but like Gab and maybe more like Christian or right-oriented social media platforms where, they're talking about like Putin's based or Putin's a national or a Christian nationalist or things like that. And again, I don't think that those memes are correct whatsoever, but I think that the reason some people feel so comfortable sharing those memes or maybe jumping to that conclusion is because of the fact that they look at mainstream media here in the West and they feel like they're not fully displaying 100% of the facts, or they're focused on certain talking points. And now, obviously, any and every media outlet is going to have their own biases, but I personally want to hold Canadian media and, to a lesser extent, North American media to a higher standard than I would, say, RT, right? Russia Today. But anyways, again, really appreciate the conversation. I hope you guys enjoy it. But again, the reason I'm so narrow focused just on this one talking point is that's really the conversation I wanted to have in regards to it. I don't think it's necessarily a fair comparison to compare the Freedom Convoy and the Nazi narrative around it versus the conflict in Ukraine and the neo-Nazi discussion there. Now, again, I want to be very clear here. I don't think that this justifies in any way. The Azov battalion could be 100% neo-Nazis, and I still don't think that that would justify Russia's invasion and the conflict that we're seeing play out. Now, in regards to how did we all get started here, I just feel like that's such a complex topic that I don't know how you could really get to the ultimate bottom of that in one conversation, particularly if you're going to try and do it within an hour or so. However, I was hopeful that we could kind of get to a conclusion in regards to the neo-Nazi narrative specifically. And my ultimate hope is, I suspect that of my viewers, people probably lean more right that view my content. I'm certainly sure of that. And they maybe even lean more towards being pro-Putin, or at least being open to exploring that sort of narrative. And I again, truly believe that the primary reason for that is likely that they've seen one or two lies or misrepresentations in mainstream media, and then that makes them immediately question everything. Now, again, I think Andri has his own biases here. I think he's entitled to them, and I understand that he's got a much more personal connection to the conflict, obviously, growing up and spending 23 years in Ukraine. And again, I really appreciate his perspectives on things. Yeah, I hope you guys find this conversation productive. If you'd like to see me have more conversations like this, just let me know in the comment section, right? Your feedback means a lot. Right now, these videos don't get a lot of comments, so understand, when you actually leave a comment, it's a big deal, and you can impact the trajectory of the content I'm making here. And then last thing, if you're going to be critical of anyone in this video, I'd much rather you focus on me and my discussion of things, because again, I understand completely where Andri's coming from and how he's kind of came to the conclusions he has. And I can understand his general frustration that we essentially spent the entire conversation talking about the neo-Nazi narrative versus the bigger context of what's going on in the conflict. But again, for the purposes of this video, I was trying to hone in just on that discussion. Again, let me know, what other conversations should I have? Do you guys disagree with me wildly on something? If so, reach out to me on social media. I'm very open to having these conversations and learning. And I feel like I did walk away with a different perspective than what I necessarily started out with. All right. Well, again, really appreciate you saying yes to this, Andri. And I guess I just want to lay things out for people how this conversation even came about. And so one of my biggest frustrations in general right now with society is how polarized a lot of different narratives are around complex subject matters. And so I'm just going to pull up a screen share here, and we'll probably have the screen share up for a good chunk of the conversation. But essentially, this all started because I put together a video documentary, whatever you kind of want to call it, about the Freedom Convoy and 14 really frustrating narratives I personally saw creep up in the Canadian media. I particularly think that there's a strong bias there to want to frame the Freedom Convoy in a negative light. And so one of the clips that I recently shared on my Instagram was about the Nazi narrative around the Freedom Convoy. And I personally think that that's just like, I almost think that the media should be embarrassed of themselves in regards to trying to push that narrative. And so you kind of jumped in here and just said, I know, just like with Ukraine, all of a sudden a country with a Jewish president, Black MP, 134 different ethnicities is called a Nazi country. Even some Americans and Canadians believed it. In 23 years of living in multiple cities in Ukraine, I haven't met a single Nazi. And so I guess I want to use this just kind of as a jumping off point, because as we kind of discussed before recording here, like a lot of people, my assumption is that my perspective is probably closer to the truth or right than other people's. And again, that's a bias that I think we're all capable of falling victim to. So I thought it'd be fun to bring you on here, kind of have a conversation. I want to lay out the two extremes of the narrative that I've seen in media. So both from like the Russian perspective, as well as like the most extreme pro-Ukraine perspectives I've seen, then kind of try and explore the truth. That's why I've got so many tabs open here for us to kind of go through. And then I'd love just kind of get your perspective on what my take is. So as we mentioned, I'm not expecting you to speak for all of Ukraine. I'm not expecting you to be the ultimate Ukraine expert, but I do appreciate that you're probably coming at this with a different perspective, as well as different experience having actually lived in Ukraine. So maybe before we like
100%.
jump into the rabbit hole of everything, if you don't mind, just kind of break down for people, what is your kind of your background, your experience in Ukraine? And if you want to kind of share your general thoughts overall on the Nazi narrative, feel free, or we can get to that at the end.
Oh, absolutely. No, I appreciate you having me on, Matt, because I believe people take media way too seriously, especially lately when social media enforces the power of it. And it's important to kind of hear the actual locals' opinions, because they do have that experience firsthand, instead of someone who just read a few titles on the media outlets. And just for everyone's understanding, by no means an expert in geopolitics. I just happened to be born and grow up in Ukraine. And about 10 years ago, I moved to Canada. And there's no political aspirations whatsoever. I definitely do not respect political career as much as I do respect entrepreneurship and capitalism. And that's basically my basic views and beliefs. And that's why it's concerning for me sometimes to see people I like and respect, like yourself, Matt, share stuff that may go against the actual situation, right? And obviously, I'm not right in everything, and I do have my subjective opinions on things, but it's at least based on me living in Ukraine for the first 23 years of my life, being pretty active socially, living in multiple cities, being a part of the Ukrainian Scouting Organization, which is basically an equivalent of Boy Scouts, which made me travel all over the country, meet all kinds of people from all walks of life. That gives me a good idea of what that country is about. And obviously there's a reason I'm not there right now, and I chose to live in Canada. So I feel like I'm less biased than someone who would be there all the time, right? Mm-hmm. And I still do have family there. I still do have lots of friends in the military, like in different sectors of like tech, or even politicians, people who are very close to the government of Ukraine too. So I do get to talk to them from time to time to get their opinions on the situation as well. But on the Nazi subject, I'm super surprised that this narrative gained so much momentum. Because after visiting about, I think it's 28 countries technically in my life, and being to Russia and being to many places in Ukraine, Ukraine would be at the very bottom of my list of countries that I would in any way call radical. And me personally, as I mentioned in the comment, I've never met a single Nazi that like clearly I can see they have like these swastikas and they talk about these ideals, right? So it's very surprising to me. Obviously, there are Nazi everywhere, including the town you're in right now. Okay. And it's like, it's not something that went extinct after the World War II. Obviously, there are people who believe all kinds of weird stuff. But to say that it's like a predominant power in Ukraine, that's at least funny to me. And the reason I'm saying that is I was just messaging my friend before this call to get his opinion too, because he's a part of the Ukrainian defense, just took a break after fighting at the front lines. Fortunately, he's still alive, and I asked him, hey, what's your take on Azov? Because that's something that you mentioned to me earlier.
Yep.
And he's like, it's a great battalion. There might be someone who's Nazi in there. I don't know. I don't know either. There might be one or two people, but it's definitely not their official reason of existence. They only came about around 2014 when Russia attacked Ukraine. They never existed before. And it's a very effective militarily battalion in the Ukrainian defense, which consists of maybe like 2-3% would be my best guess of the whole Ukrainian defense members. If that helps, we can dive into more details on that, and I can give you more examples on what I know from my own life.
Yeah, again, appreciate it. And like I said, I kind of want to explore the two extremes of the narrative that I've seen presented. And if you think that there's more nuance or like more extremes than the extremes I've been exposed to, definitely open to it. I think maybe even before getting into that, one thing I want to kind of frame this conversation with is I do think that there's individuals out there that end up taking it further to the extreme because either that's obviously politically expedient to the kind of arguments they're trying to make, or they notice that there's kind of like the full truth isn't being told. And then so that makes it very easy for individuals to kind of want to jump to conclusions and say, well, it must be the extreme worst thing possible. If they're not telling me all the truth, then they must be lying about absolutely everything. And I think that that's something I've personally regularly seen, whether it's around the Ukraine narrative, whether it's around COVID narrative, whether it's around the Freedom Convoy, whether it's around January 6th, is that right now in the political discourse, I just feel like no one's willing to give an inch, or they fear that if they even falter whatsoever in kind of their extreme view, that that'll open up a vector of attack, and that immediately everything that they've ever said will be like called into question. And I guess for myself, the most frustrating part about that is the moment someone takes an extreme view and isn't willing to explore the nuance, it makes me naturally think that like they're either not open to exploring the conversation or they don't actually care about it. And with the Freedom Convoy, that's a huge frustrating aspect because, you know, I was very involved, at least watching and observing and kind of reporting on what was going on there. And again, got very frustrated with the narrative I saw from mainstream media. But let's jump into kind of
I'm with you on that.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, what was happening in Canada was very surprising to me, coming from an extremely freedom-loving country of Ukraine. What I was seeing there, I was like, okay, maybe it's time to move. There's no bright future after I noticed how the government of Canada reacted to people's desire to voice their opinion, right? So honestly, this was extremely surprising to me. So anyone who accuses Ukrainian government of being authoritarian, and if they are from Canada, they need to look closer at their home country first. That's for sure.
Yeah, I think there's an authoritarian bent in a lot of countries these days, which I find distasteful. But we'll pull up the screen share here and just kind of go through what the two extremes are. And for anyone that's watching this, there's going to be links in the video description down below to everything I'm sharing here, because I definitely don't want this to be the end of your fact-finding journey, but just kind of a springboard or jumping off point. So first of all, if anyone wants to check out the Wikipedia on Azov is here, it's pretty long and thorough. There definitely is references to neo-Nazi ideology, but I don't think that we don't need to get into Wikipedia that deep. I guess what I first wanted to highlight is that one of the first things that put this in general on my radar was Oliver Stone's movie he did, Ukraine on Fire. And so in that, and I know there's criticisms of that film as well, but just kind of want to give people context about how I even kind of first got exposed to this stuff. Because I'll be honest, when Euromaidan was going down and 2014 and stuff like that, I just wasn't paying a lot of attention. I didn't necessarily have like a horse in that race or anything like that. And even back then, it was the sort of thing where I was like, I'm going to have to go down a giant rabbit hole of research to even try and have a full understanding here, but just want to give people that context. So first, just going to start off here with Al Jazeera. So profile, who are Ukrainians far-right Azov regiment? And so I think this is actually relatively balanced in my opinion. But if we were going to kind of frame the two extremes, I would say the one extreme I see is, people on maybe like social media platforms like Gab, people really buying into the RT or Russia Today narrative and essentially saying like, this is the number one reason that Putin invaded was to stop these Nazis and stuff like that. Personally, I feel like, and this is just my take on this, but if Putin was to write a list of the 20 reasons he invaded, maybe after the first one or two, he starts just kind of BSing and like essentially trying to grab anything he can in order to try and justify that. And I really think that in my perspective, that's probably how this all came about in the first place. And we'll jump into some of the RT articles in a second. And then on the other extreme I see is, Ukraine's a perfect country, like all of our allies, they're absolutely perfect. There's not a single skeleton in their closet. And, probably never has even been a Nazi in Ukraine. And obviously, those two narratives are just so disingenuous, in my opinion, and so frustrating because, like I said, I think that, I guess one thing I'll even say here is I think, periods of extreme, so periods of like war or being attacked can make for strange bedfellows. And I think that people will be more prone to being open in regards to like the degrees of freedom they might present or allow to their allies. And I think I can understand that. But one thing I would love to see from mainstream media here in the West is just kind of like admitting that, like, hey, you know what? We think that Putin's a worse bad guy than anything that maybe is going on in Eastern Ukraine. And so because of that, this is why we're kind of pushing so hard on this. But let's go through Al Jazeera and a couple of these articles.
Before we dive into that, Matt,
yep.
I'm glad that you brought this stance up on like extremes. Obviously, there's no truth in purely black or white. There's something in between. I'm with you on that. And the articles you brought up, and I haven't had a chance to look through all of them before the call, unfortunately, and even the Wikipedia, obviously they have to use some kind of sources. And the sources would normally be Western media because Wikipedia would trust them more than anything else. The Ukrainian ones, unfortunately, some Western sources very often just use Russia Today as a source, which is purely controlled by Putin. And I don't know why we still trust any dictator on this planet at all. But let's first of all take a step back and think of the whole war. Because before we dive into small details of certain things and guess about things we don't really know about, let's start from the basics. Like, this is a Russian war. They attacked an independent country which never had any threat to Russia whatsoever. There are no facts proving that, at least, right? And before 2014, even Azov didn't exist, which is maybe nationalistic in their views, given it's a volunteer organization, but definitely has nothing to do with neo-Nazi ideology officially. Maybe there's someone who has. Maybe there's someone like your neighbor that has. Doesn't really matter, really. It doesn't make your country not neo-Nazi, you know what I mean? So if we look at the whole war, like, at least we need to agree on a few things. Do we want the war? I would assume your response is no, we don't want the war.
Yeah, I'm an extreme anti-interventionist. So yeah, against pretty much all war.
Exactly. Now you have a lot in common with 99% of Ukrainians. That do we want the war to end as permanently as possible, or just temporarily is okay for us, and then have another war later?
Oh, sorry. I've taken some of these as rhetorical. Yeah, I would love for a long-term solution to be found here. And again, right now, it seems like both sides aren't presenting like any sort of give there. And so I suspect that, unfortunately, for particularly just the average Ukrainian, this is going to drag on for an extended period of time.
Yeah, we'll see what happens, because it depends on various factors, but at least we agree that we want a permanent solution. Now we can chat more about some details further on, right? Now, if Ukraine does give up some territory for weird reasons, some Westerners, my friends in Canada and the USA, assume Russia will just stop, which makes no sense whatsoever because we have precedents. We have history of many territories that used to be Ukraine are under Russia right now. They never stopped. Now there's this whole BS story about Crimea actually being Russian, which has nothing to do with historic facts either. And then some people who have never been to Ukraine, some of them never been to Europe even, assume that they've heard that in this and that article, this Fox News or Russia Today, now it must be true, you know? And we assume those things because we look at some websites that look legit, they're designed to look legit. Like they've been doing this for ages, so they know what they're doing. And now we assume, we jump to conclusions and we're like, who cares about Ukraine? Why don't we just give whatever Putin, the terrorist, is asking? That means the terrorist will stop. The more you give the terrorist what he's asking, the more chances we have it'll stop. Do you see any logic in this? Because I don't. Like if a criminal came to your house and they stole something, you're like, no worries, you want to take something else? Take this, just never come back again. What do you think happens in their psychology? They want to come back or not?
Yeah, I definitely think it's like complex in that regards, but I agree that just because you give up Crimea or you give up another part of Eastern Ukraine, I don't know, like without a very clear definition of how we're going to make sure there isn't continued creep, I don't necessarily see it ending. So yeah, again, not going to disagree with you on that. And like, I feel like this will end up spiraling into a multi-hour interview if we end up not kind of narrowing in just on more the Nazi narrative here, because again, I think that like this to me isn't necessarily representative of everything going on in Ukraine. It's more representative of the way media in general, regardless West, East or somewhere in between, is when it comes to it. That I think there's so little reporting these days that's not biased to some degree, and it's just frustrating because you're allowed to have your biases, but I think you just need to own them, and that's really what I'd love to see all media do. And at least with like RT, like we kind of know off the bat it's going to be extremely biased, right? Because it literally is state controlled. To a lesser extent, I think CBC is also biased in certain ways because it's government owned. To a lesser extent, I think that, particularly here in Canada, like companies like the National Post and Globe and Mail, they've got at least a slight bias towards Canada because there's funding. And I would love to eventually just see media companies in general fully display where all their sources of income come, because this is kind of a tangent here, but I'm also kind of actively involved in crypto and NFTs and stuff like that. And there was recently the FTX whole debacle, and there's still positive reporting coming out about SBF, Sam Bankman-Fried. And it's crazy because this guy essentially either like stole billions of dollars or misled investors for billions of dollars. And yet you still have the New York Times coming out doing puff pieces on him. But we'll get back on course here and jump into the main things. So the first one here is Al Jazeera. Again, they're going to have their own biases, but not necessarily the same as West or exactly Russia either. But just wanted to highlight some of the things that they kind of talk about. So the way they frame it is Azov is a far-right, all-volunteer infantry military unit whose members, estimated at 900, are ultra-nationalistic and accused of harboring neo-Nazi and white supremacist ideology. And so I think one of the things that people will often point to is the original founder of Azov. And it definitely seems like he was an ultra nationalist. And again, sometimes these terms are almost used interchangeably, but I do think that there's more nuance there between being an ultra nationalist and necessarily automatically a fascist or automatically a neo-Nazi.
You're so right about that.
But
and
again,
I'm honestly, personally, as a Ukrainian, happy that there's a rise of nationalism. So people who respect the fact that they're Ukrainians and want to save their nationality and in the threat of war. And it wouldn't have happened without the war, obviously, but you're so right. There's nationalism. There's nothing to do about hating others. And there's Nazi ideology, which is the exact opposite. It's like, we are the best. Everybody else doesn't matter.
And so I'll probably mispronounce a lot of these names here, but we'll just roll with it. Andri Beletsky. So essentially back in 2010, one of the things Al Jazeera highlights here was he said Ukraine's national purpose was to lead the white races of the world to a final crusade against Semite-led Untermenschen, inferior races. So again, I think that this is where a lot of the initial story starts, right? And if I understand correctly, I think in 2014 he 2014 or 2015 he stepped away from Azov because he became a politician and remained an MP in Ukraine until 2019. And so you
Right.
can't be part of the military or police force and be a politician. So just wanted to kind of like frame that first.
Right.
And again,
So
we're
a
not.
couple things before we dive into
Yep.
this deeper. I don't know the guy. I've never heard of him. I don't think he's important. And like I have family there. They never talk. Like he doesn't really matter, to be honest with you. Now, whether he said something, maybe many things said, lots of stupid things, including Donald Trump, and nobody cares about it, you know. Now he's not a part of Azov, at least at this point.
Yeah,
And
but he
Azov
was
is
the founder.
purely a military organization. What he believes personally doesn't matter in terms of what Azov stands for. And again, just to be clear, we're talking about like a couple percent of the Ukrainian defense, and all the attention goes into those couple percent battalion, right? And maybe there are a few people who believe something radical, like in any country in the world.
Yeah, and so again, like I think it's important to have a conversation here where we can talk about Azov or aspects or subsegments of Azov and
Uh-huh.
try and determine whether there is like a neo-Nazi connection. And even if there is, that doesn't automatically condemn all Ukrainians, the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian military, or anything like that, or it doesn't automatically justify the Russian narrative either. So I want to be very clear here. This is more just about, again, at the end of the day, trying to get down to the truth. In 2015, you know, the spokesperson for the regiment at the time said 10 to 20% of Azov's recruits were Nazis. And so just kind of
Who's
jumping over
that
to,
guy?
sorry,
Andri Dechko? Who's that guy who came up with the statistic?
he was the spokesperson for the regiment at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so this kind of references to a US Today article. So volunteer Ukrainian unit includes Nazis. Again, you can include Nazis without necessarily being a purely Nazi battalion or anything like that. But in an interview with USA Today, he admitted he is a Nazi and said with a laugh that no more than half his comrades are fellow Nazis. And now this is in regards to a individual drill sergeant who only goes by the name Alex and was wearing a patch depicting Thor's hammer. And so I think that that's something that you regularly see brought up as well. Is there certain imagery that, you know, either borrows or lends from or has a lot of similarities to the original Nazi movement, which again, I think there is a certain aspect of nuance there. I know on one interview I was watching, an individual was trying to explain the Russian and before Russia, the USSR's prison system, and that a lot of people that were naturally anti-communist kind of borrowed symbolism from Nazism just because there was such a like we can't get into it, but like the Holodomor and everything that Ukraine's been through over the last 100 years is just like absolutely insane. And it's probably one of the biggest tragedies that no one really talks about. And I understand, or at least I think I understand, how that can lend itself towards wanting to be very anti-communist. And for individuals that maybe see, you know, I don't think this is true, but like the opposite of communism is fascism or Nazism, I can understand why they might borrow some strong imagery from it. But again, anyways, later on, the actual spokesperson, so not this Alex, he's the one that was quoted as saying 10 to 20% of the group's members are Nazis. And so again, I don't think that this immediately condemns every single person that's in the Azov brigade or battalion. But when I'm looking at, you know, Western media's desire to jump to conclusions on the Freedom Convoy or jump to conclusions on January 6th, I find it disingenuous for them to want to make it like the Freedom Convoy and the Azov battalion and trying to say like, you know, Freedom Convoy, we need to be really concerned about their Nazi ties, but Azov battalion will kind of overlook it. And so again, this is one of the narratives that's frustrating to me because I think it actually does a disservice to arguing the pro-Ukraine side, because I think if there was a willingness to like admit certain aspects of this, then individuals that are more prone to like kind of going down conspiracy rabbit holes, they wouldn't be able to point and be like, see, they're telling you that they're like, there's nothing wrong here, that there's nothing going on whatsoever. And I think that that's how we end up with like these extreme memes that I see like propagating on websites like Gab, where people are like, you know, Putin's actually super based and he's a Christian nationalist and he actually really cares about the Ukrainian people and stuff like that. Because from my perspective, that just falls so flat on the surface, because if he actually did care, there were so many other approaches he obviously could have taken versus creating a hot conflict in Ukraine.
Okay, so let's, if you want, you can share the screen as well, because it's not going to be related to this specific quote. Let's look back again from the bigger picture. We can narrow down and understand what's going on with these media outlets. Russia attacked Ukraine. I still struggle to understand the reasons. I looked up their websites, government official websites, and their media, which is basically the government, trying to understand what they're after, and I can't. Like, it's hard to understand. And I don't want to believe it's purely genocide, but so far, the facts show that most likely it's just some hatred. So if there's anything in common with Nazis, you'd find way more of it on the Russian side. And again, the Azov battalion that you love for some reason, that's like a few percent of the whole military organization of Ukraine, which also is a few percent of the whole country, right? So it's like, we're talking really about 90 to 180 people, everybody, the Wikipedia, those Al Jazeera, all of these resources you shared are talking about, if the numbers are correct that they're sharing, 90 to 180 people, 20 to 30%. If it's 900 people in a battalion, what is 10%? 90 people. What is 20%? 180. We're really concerned about 90 to 180 people. There are more people who die in a day in Ukraine right now. And we're so concentrated on that little fact that somebody said something and they must be right, But again, you see what you want to see realistically. Like, I thought that everybody's pro-capitalism, everybody's pro-human rights, until I started meeting other people who are not in my closest circle. Same with this Andri Dyachenko, Andri Beletsky, whoever they are. They may think that everybody around them is Nazi because they have certain views that are like Nazi views, right? But if those numbers are correct, I don't know if it's worth spending all of this time only talking about this 90 to 180 people that might be potentially, if these two people are right, neo-Nazis. So if there are really under 200 people in the country of 44 million people that are Nazis, does it really matter? Because I'm sure there are more in Canada, and I'm sure there are more in the US, and definitely more in Russia, probably more in any country in Europe.
I guess I'll disagree with you on that.
You know what I mean?
I don't believe that there's more Nazis in Canada. There's no history there. Nazis never occupied Canada. I think that, again, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a huge Nazi movement in Ukraine, right? And like, my perspective,
your opinion, you know what I mean? Like, you don't have real data, and none of these websites that you use,
there's no regiment
really
in Canada that's
to confirm that,
associated with neo-Nazis, or where people claim that it's 10 to 20%.
Which is exactly the case with Ukraine as well. You know what I mean?
Well, like this one regiment. And again, I understand the frustration here, because maybe it feels like,
just to be clear, that one regiment, just so we don't talk about stuff that isn't true, because we're seeking, both of us are seeking truth here. When you look up the actual websites and all the official information on the regiment, there's nothing in common with Nazi values. It's all the media trying to create fuss, because what media cares about is the views. So officially, there's nothing Nazi. There's the least amount of support in Europe for far-right parties in Ukraine. Like, there's Jewish
is there stats backing that up?
MP. There are 134 ethnicities. I personally studied with Russians, Tatars, Middle Eastern, African people in my class at the university in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. I've never felt any Nazi moods whatsoever, you know what I mean? And obviously, I'm biased in a way that I have that experience, but at the same time, I'm not claiming there's no Nazi whatsoever, because they're Nazi, and I'm sure they're Nazi in Canada too, even though me and you don't want to believe that, because people don't have. Well,
again, I'm not saying there's no Nazis in Canada, to be very specific here. I'm just saying that I think there's more evidence in Ukraine. But anyways, like, I don't want to belabor this point too much. Like, this is primarily just a conversation around the narratives that are being presented by the media on this.
Right.
And
exactly. I think, so there's more narrative, not evidence. That's what I wanted to clarify.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then, like, we look at the media of Canada, they show Nazis on in Ottawa on the trucker convoy, which is obviously not the representation of the actual convoy. You know what I mean? Now you know that this is the exact same play being played here.
Okay. Again, I do think that there's a little bit more nuance there, but for the sake of continuing forward, I'll just move on. So this is from the Human Rights Watch. So Ukraine fatal attack on Roma settlement. And so again, this relates to the Azov battalion and ultra nationalists, which don't necessarily immediately mean that they're actually neo-Nazis or anything like that. But this is one of the things that you'll regularly see, I think, brought up, whether it's from RT or other sort of like individuals that lean on the pro-Putin side of things. And so I do think that there's weird stuff that has gone on from both sides in Eastern Ukraine that I think would be easy to condemn, both like Russian actions as well as this like subsegment of ultra nationalists in Eastern Ukraine. And so again, I think in a perfect world, this conflict just wouldn't happen in the first place. And a better world than we live today, I think that we would see media and politicians be very honest about these things, but then also give it probably the context that you're trying to give it here, where it's like, look, there are bad actors. There's going to be bad actors across the world. Maybe there's even a slightly higher percentage of bad actors in this one community or this one brigade, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it negates the actual overall arguments around this conflict, right? So again, even if it turned out that the Azov battalion was 100% neo-Nazis, and I do not believe that's the case, that still wouldn't necessarily, it absolutely wouldn't justify Putin's actions, and it wouldn't naturally mean that like,
Right.
oh, we in the West shouldn't support Ukraine in any
So
aspect.
now let me ask you a question. If like I agree with you on what you just said, what's the reason everybody's talking about neo-Nazis that don't really matter that much?
And I don't know if everyone's talking about it, because I see it on social media a decent amount, but I don't necessarily see mainstream press talking about it. And I think that the reason that you see so many more people talking about on social media is because they naturally assume that like, well, if they're not talking about this thing that I can kind of definitively prove, or at least point to aspects of truth in, they must be lying about everything. And I think that, again, that's where people end up going down kind of a spiral or rabbit hole of conspiracies, where they're like, again, going to the most extreme version, as you kind of mentioned in your Instagram post, where they're like, Zelensky's a Nazi, every, Ukrainian's a Nazi, and we shouldn't support them, and Putin's the good guy. And I think that, again, if the mainstream media, if the corporate press was more willing to have these nuanced conversations and just be like, again, put it in context, I think that would be harder for conspiracy theorists to like seem like they've got traction, or that they've actually like built on a solid foundation their arguments.
Well, you've showed me a few sources, including USA Today, Al Jazeera. They're clearly talking about this narrative, which I'll give you my opinion on why it exists.
We haven't got the next one here from CNN.
Here you go.
A far-right battalion has a key role in Ukraine's resistance. Its neo-Nazi history has been exploited by Putin. So again, I think for every article that like either does talk about it or downplays it or doesn't mention it at all, that there's a counter argument there. We've also got CBS News here, the Azov battalion, how Putin built a false premise for a war against Nazis in Ukraine. And again, if I was trying to give my nuanced take, I actually agree with this, right? Like, I think that it's a false narrative or premise that he's using to build a narrative about Nazis in Ukraine. But that also doesn't mean that immediately there's zero Nazis. And again, in a perfect world, I would just love to see the mainstream media be more honest about all their reporting, or if they're going to be biased, like own it, in my opinion. And then again, talking about bias, we can jump over here to RT, where we can see that they've been publishing articles, like they've got an entire section on Azov Battalion News, which I think, again, shows like they're very focused on pushing this, and it is a small aspect of the entire Ukrainian military, and an even smaller aspect of the population.
Right. Do you want my take on why this is happening, both on Russia Today and Western media?
Sure.
Like, realistically, I am in awe with how powerful Russian propaganda is, and you're looking at it right now. Like, this looks legit. And people like you and people like me who grew up in the West take this as truth. And they're like, maybe it's not 100% truth, but there must be some truth to it. And why is this good for Russia? Like, how else can you justify destroying a prosperous, beautiful, economically growing country? Purely destroying. Like, my family had to spend few days already, like with no constant light. Like there's
Mhm.
no electricity. They're being the civilian buildings are being bombed for the last 9 months. It has nothing to do with military targets. There's no reason, like there's no way to justify this militarily, to simply destroying major infrastructure in civilian areas. How else can you justify to anyone this? Well, there must be some Nazis. Like let's again take a step back. Before 2014, even this Azov battalion that somehow became famous for somebody saying something that may not be true, which is a very minor percentage of the whole Ukrainian defense, didn't exist. What happened in 2014 is Russia started the military invasion on the eastern parts of Ukraine. So if Russia never started it, even the reason of all of these tabs you have open right now wouldn't exist. You know what I mean? Now let's imagine, like, let's just build a parallel for something people can relate to. Let's imagine, hypothetically, China attacks the United States. Okay. Let's guess, would there be some Americans that would claim that America is the best nation in the world? We need to destroy everyone who looks like Chinese. We need to protect ourselves because we are a threat of not existing anymore. Would you say there would be a few percent of people who would believe
Oh,
that at that
absolutely. And again,
stage
like I
in that
said, I
war?
think in general, when it comes to like extremes, right? And war is obviously like one of the
Oh, it
most
is an extreme.
extremes we
Yeah.
can have. I think it naturally lends to strange bedfellows, right? And like again, I imagine that the US military, if they were actively like if there was an existential threat to America, I think a lot of their woke ideology we see regularly like published in the media would disappear. They would no longer
Agreed.
care if you had a tattoo that maybe they disagreed with or anything like that, because like they'd be like, shit, we've actually got an existential threat here. We need to protect ourselves, protect our country. I don't care if people are using racial slurs or if people are being mean to Chinese citizens if we literally think that our country could cease to exist. So yeah, again, like
There you
I
go.
completely understand that. At the same time, I would love to see the press just kind of own it and be like, these people don't represent the majority of individuals. This doesn't mean that we should, give up on the fight with China again in this like scenario here. So yeah, I definitely understand where you're coming from. And I think that again, it probably feels like I'm focusing way too much on the Nazi narrative here, but that was kind of the framing I wanted for this
You definitely
conversation, just
are.
because
Yeah, you definitely
like the
are.
war is honestly too big to cover in like one video, in my opinion. And for me, like
Well, it
I'm
is
not
and
gonna
it
lie,
isn't.
I
Yeah,
well,
go
I
ahead.
think it is just because you have, like you said, you kind of have to go back to 2014, and I would argue like you kind of have to go back to the Holodomor, and I think you probably have to even go back further to really get the full
Agreed.
context of everything around
Yeah.
that, right? The same way that like I think if people are talking about like um the IRA in Ireland, right? Like I think that that's a whole thing to unpack there in and of itself. I'm have Irish background. The beard may give it away, and essentially, again, I don't think that you can like do it justice in one video or one conversation, but like honestly, and again, I understand if you walk away from this conversation not having the same impression that I do, but I actually believe by having this conversation and trying to expose like a more nuanced take on it, I think that there's individuals that probably regularly watch my content that probably do take the RT headlines at face value. And I hope
Oh,
that
for
by
sure.
having a more nuanced conversation around it, they'll realize that like, oh no, like maybe I should be thinking more critically about it. Maybe I should be reading through and trying to like not just choose like one news source, but try and literally get the full spectrum of news sources, try and put it into context. And I think that it's more likely to actually change someone's opinion versus if I was just like, this doesn't matter at all. Because I think that that would be the same sort of dismissiveness that they naturally feel in regards to the way at least certain Western media news outlets approach this stuff. And I think that, again, that's what leads them down like a path of not radicalization, but like, again, conspiracy theories and things like that. And then just assuming that anything could be true
Yeah,
around
but
what's going on.
here's the thing. We talk about Nazis in Ukraine because Russia decided we need to talk about it. That's just pure facts. They came up with this as a problem. It used to be their reason for the war. They no longer talk about it as much, but they still have very big influence over Western media, unfortunately. And we don't think that's Russian propaganda, but it is, because they build a brand about themselves that they conquered Nazis. They think USSR is
Yep.
just Russia, but it's not. It's a
Yep.
separate structure, just like European Union is not Germany. So they're like, we conquered Nazis, we saved the world. Realistically, when you really dig into the history of it, the way you like to look at things, you see that there was an agreement between Stalin and Hitler on the ways they would divide the Europe. So if Germans didn't start the war, next day Soviets would start the war. Didn't really matter. The ideologies and the naming you put there doesn't really matter. It's just branding. So it was like Nazis and Russians at the time, basically the same thing. They wanted to conquer the world. They wanted to be the main guy. They didn't care about others. They were like, if I talked to locals in Ukrainian villages, which I did, they were treated better by Nazis than by the Russians.
And that is something you'll regularly hear, proven, which is disgusting, but yeah, it's true.
So now if we look at the grand scale of things, the war and the issues that Europe always had with the wars, for 70 years, there was no war because after the World War II, there were some international agreements in place. There was more economic prosperity, which was amazing. And we wanted to see more of that. But for some reason, Russia had this imperialistic view still. And they were like, no, we are the best in the world. Let's fix these things. Let's change the world order. And that's what's happening. And my personal view is Russia's not going to exist as what it is right now within our lifetime, most likely. Obviously, it takes long when the empire is within the same territory. It's not like the British Empire, which had colonies all over the world that are easier for the colonies to become independent. But at the same time, like Russia has been the weakest it's ever been right now because they overlooked. They believe in their own propaganda. They thought Ukrainians will just welcome them. Their war was supposed to last 3 days. Like, it's laughable. Because they thought Ukraine would just hug them when they came. Ukraine proven to the world in the last 30 years they want nothing to do with communism, nothing to do with dictatorships. They want the freedom, they want the capitalism, they want the democratic values to rule the country. And that's exactly what's happening. What makes me smile even more when I read the Western media, more than the Nazi narrative, which is funny on itself, is claiming that Zelensky is this evil dictator. Guys, Zelensky doesn't really matter. I know you come from your own country and you build parallels, the way things are run. Zelensky has been in his chair for what, like since 2019, what is it? 3 years. Like the war started before him. And he's a Jew. Obviously, it's not a Nazi-run country. And that Ukrainians don't care whether he's a Jew or Russian or German or Polish, doesn't, like, as long as he does the work, he's hired. That's how we Ukrainians think about politicians. And in the 30 years of Ukrainian independence from the Soviet Union, which is the best thing to happen for Ukraine in the last 100 years, we changed 6 presidents. How many other countries changed 6 presidents, 6 governments in the last 30 years? Like, these facts clearly tell you that people rule in Ukraine. So whenever I see a title that says something about Zelensky versus Putin, they're not equal. Russia has always been pro-emperor. They can't exist without one ruler. You look up the history, you see that's how they're wired. There's no democracy whatsoever. Nobody stands up for whatever they believe in. It's like basically sheeple, right? With Ukraine, you see they have revolutions. They change their governments. Like, they tell the government what needs to be done. So there's no control realistically over the Ukrainian people. As long as Zelensky is done with his job, somebody else will take his place. That's how it's working in Ukraine. There's no need for strict dictator. People like self-policing. I remember living in Kyiv and seeing people putting stickers on people who park improperly. You don't even need the policeman to put a ticket on the car, you know? Like, people self-police themselves. There's like, Zelensky does not rule the country. He's working for the people. Maybe he's making mistakes. Everybody does. He is not perfect, and nobody says he is. He's just doing his work. You know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%. And like, I forget whether we said this before we started recording or not, like, but I think you kind of mentioned it, and I want to double down on the sentiment. I personally think that you can't trust any politician, and that in general is true of whether we're talking in Canada, the US, Ukraine, Russia, China. It literally doesn't matter. I think that they're always going to have, like, I think at the end of the day, people define reality as like me-centric, right? Or me and my family. And then it's me and my family versus my village. And then it's my village versus my state, right? And my state versus the country, and the country versus the world. And
Mhm.
yeah, so definitely agree with that. I think that what's truly unfortunate, you're right about the Russian imperialist motive, right? And I think the US has a different terms of engagement when it comes to their imperialism, but I think that there's also imperialism there. And what we end up seeing,
Agreed.
in my opinion, and I sadly think this is going to end up being true of Ukraine as well, is that like smaller countries end up in the tug of war between, like, whether it's a Russia and a US, or it's a US and China. And like whether we look at Afghanistan as a previous version of that, or Syria, or wherever else proxy wars have been fought, it honestly does a massive disservice for the media not to call out everyone on this bullshit, because I truly would like to believe that there's a version where none of this had to play out this way. And that's obviously probably pretty idealistic. But again, it honestly like grinds my gears so much that, like, whether, and I think we're seeing a whole different version of this play out right now with China and their road and belt initiative, right? And they found a different type of way to try and get smaller governments to capitulate to them. And the US had
Yeah.
their way, Russia had their way, the UK had their way before that.
Yeah.
And, the sooner people can honestly just like explore these truths, I think that we would see a lot of interventionism drop off in general. And I believe that the average Russian citizen probably doesn't want this war either, right? And we've definitely
Well,
seen.
unfortunately, they do, and that's the problem. That's the real. And I know it's hard to believe that because you think the way people live around you is the way everybody lives on the planet. And I thought that way too. I used to have Russian friends until February 24th, when no one from Russia messaged me to ask what's going on, how are you, how's your family?
And
And
I
then you
guess
look at the
just to
statistics,
build upon
and
that,
uh,
is do you think that's purely like they've got like bad intentions there, or do you think, is there a fear that the state could see, like, because I guess I'd find it hard to believe that if you had like a large friend base of Russians, that like no one would care or be anti-war. Again, maybe it
I
actually
couldn't believe
is.
that myself.
Maybe it is a much smaller percentage than I'd realize, because I think it's honestly almost impossible to truly understand or grok another culture. And naturally, a lot of us have like normalcy or recency bias, where we assume that
Right.
like our experience does project onto
Apply to the
others.
whole world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, have you been to Ukraine?
No, I've never left North
No.
America.
Okay. Well, and that's the problem. Like, most people who are talking about these issues in Europe have never even been to Europe. You know what I mean? I
Yes,
don't blame
but
them.
to be fair, I don't think
It's
you have to visit. I think that can add layers of understanding and context. I
Oh, it
do think.
changes a lot. Like, you've been to the US, right?
Yep.
Would you say you understand their mentality, the way of life?
Yeah, but I would say the reason I do is, like, in Canada, our culture is kind of US light, in my opinion.
It's
So
similar.
I
Yeah.
would say we're
So no,
almost.
it's a good parallel. If you think of me, who grew up in Ukraine, so 23 years in Ukraine, multiple cities, do you think, and I've been to Russia, do you think I understand the mentality of Russians?
Well, I guess to me, it's like a spectrum, so it's not binary. So, like, could you understand Russians better than, say, myself? Yeah, I definitely
I
could
think I
believe
lost
that.
the sound 1 second.
Oh,
Can you say something right now?
yep. Test, test.
Sorry, I can't hear you. Boom, boom, test, test.
Test, test.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Has anything changed? No.
No.
Let's see if this works. Okay, say something.
Yep. Test, test.
Okay, yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay.
As long as there's no echo, we can continue on.
Okay. So yeah, what I was just saying there is, to me, I don't think of it as like necessarily binary. Like, do you understand Russia or do you not? I think it's a spectrum, right? As in, like, and again, do I think that someone that spent time in Ukraine and Russia would probably be able to have a better perspective and understanding of the average Russian sentiment? Like, yeah, absolutely agree with
Right.
that. I also
So
do
what I
think
wanted to
that.
say with that, sorry, Matt, I'll interrupt you here. What I want to say with that before I lose, there's a huge difference in terms of culture and mentality between Ukrainians and Russians. And I didn't believe myself until the recent events. And the difference is in the way people perceive their society within, like how it's governed. So the way people treat their government and the values that people pursue during their lifetimes. So for Westerners I met who've been to Ukraine and Russia, and especially those who've been outside of St. Petersburg and Moscow, they agree with me on that. They're like, in Russia, nobody smiles, everyone's hiding, no one's looking in the eyes. That's taught behavior from the times of USSR. And the reason that's the case is people don't want to stand out because the government will follow anyone who disagrees. So if you were doing whatever you're doing here in Canada, with all these shows and everything in Russia, you wouldn't exist for too long. You wouldn't probably be even alive because you question the government, if that makes sense. So it's very similar to China in that way. USSR was basically the same kind of rule. Ukraine, on the opposite side, is very different. There are people who disagree with each other all the time. There's always this battalion of who's right, who's wrong. There's always, like, the elections are quite often, and people pursue like freedoms. They want to build their lives economically stable. They travel the world. Like, you look at the average Russian, they haven't even been abroad, you know? You look at the average Ukrainian, they've been to most of Europe. They speak different languages. They have beautiful households. They make good money. Like, my friends make more than me here in Canada because they work in the tech sector. They're very smart people. So it's like a huge difference society-wise. And the reason it's important is Russians do support the war, most of them, unfortunately, as long as Russia wins, because they're used to be part of this big power who can stand up to the USA and China maybe. And that gives them that feeling of importance, if that makes sense. While, like, look at this fact. After the first mobilization, so when Putin announced we need this, I don't know, 200,000 more people to join the army, because they lost a lot, like they lose in the war, realistically. A lot of Russians, especially our age, left the country as soon as they could. And the problem they had, a lot of them didn't even have the passport. So everybody who did, or most of them, tried to leave the country. People I know left the country because they didn't want to join the army. If now they have to fight, no, thank you. Now, here's an important question. How many protests of Russians in Turkey, Georgia, other countries they were able to escape to, you've seen against the war?
Yeah, I'll be honest. The only protests I've seen are the ones in Russia, and they often look like they have negative consequences to the individuals protesting, right? Like, you'll see them often being taken off relatively violently. So.
You're right, zero. So no Russians have ever protested the war outside Russia, where it's safe. No one's going to tell them.
I do lean towards that it probably is safe enough for them to speak out against Russia. One thing I'll give for context, though, is with like a lot of expats that are like of Chinese descent, there is often concern that your country is so authoritarian that they'll go after your family members. And certainly that's true in China. Again, no idea whether there's a Russian equivalent there, but
yeah, that might happen. But here's the thing.
Appreciate the context.
Yeah, here's the thing. Ukraine used to be under the USSR. Ukraine used to be ruled the exact same way. You know what I mean? And for some reason, Ukraine does protest successfully. One of my classmates was shot in his head in 2014 on the revolution in the city center of Kyiv for peacefully protesting. So the exact same methods to scare the population used to be applied in Ukraine to control the population, because any government wants more power, right? And it just doesn't work because Ukrainians would rather die than lose the freedom. That's not the case with Russians. They want to survive. They don't think about consequences that much. They better escape the country and still be quiet than actually change the situation. So anyone who tells me, oh, at some point, because Russia's losing so bad and it's such a humiliation, Russian people will just stand up to the government and something will change. No, I'd be extremely surprised if that ever happens. They will not stand up to their government ever. They never have.
Well, I appreciate the context for sure. So just jumping back onto the articles here. So I'm just going to kind of fly through them because this we've definitely gone off on a few tangents I wasn't expecting, but appreciate. So CBS News, this is from 2014, just for context. So this was just about individuals in the battalion with Nazi insignias and swastikas on their helmets. And so again, more just for the context of this conversation, you know, I don't think that you would find like Canadian soldiers that would be comfortable wearing that sort of thing. Now, again, I definitely
You don't
am
think?
open to the idea that there could be more context to those sorts of photos, or it maybe doesn't have the exact same meaning that we
Are
might
these real
take here.
photos?
Sorry.
Are these real photos?
Well, it's from CBS News and it's been reported. Like
So
if we jump
CBS
over,
News is on the ground in Ukraine right now?
well, it was 2014, but I believe that they were there in 2014 for the Euromaidan. And then
Maybe.
we've
Like
got this
that's
from,
the issue. Like we don't really check sources that much these days. We see this CBS or whatever website, CNN, we're like, oh, this is truth. No, usually it's not. You know what I mean? Yeah, these pictures can be found online. I've seen so many of the same photo being photoshopped with different flags. Like there's a flag of Nazi in some Ukrainian soldiers' hands, and then I see the same photos with a different flag of Israeli people. You know, like it's interesting that we don't really check the sources. Yeah, maybe somebody has that. Maybe that 80 to 180 people, sorry, 90 to 180 people of the whole Ukrainian defense has some Nazi views. Does it deserve that much attention, really? That's my big question. Yeah, Russia wants you to talk about it because Russia wants to justify the genocide they're doing. You know what I mean?
yeah. And I guess from my perspective, I think you can talk about these things and talk about the nuance without necessarily justifying the Russian aggression, right? Or Russia starting this
If that's
war.
the case, Matt, help me understand, why do you think this is such a trendy topic?
I personally don't think it's trendy, to be honest. Like, I don't like
It is.
outside
I
of,
checked yesterday on Twitter. It is. I don't know
well,
why.
outside of social media and memes, right? And I think that that is a whole different beast versus what's being presented by mainstream media and the corporate press. But then this is from the National Post from 2015. Fears that Canadian training mission in Ukraine may unintentionally help neo-Nazi groups. So US lawmakers have voted to block American troops from training a Ukrainian unit with neo-Nazi members, raising questions about what safeguards Canada has. So again, we'll have links to all these articles for anyone that wants to sink their teeth into it. You know, there was a controversy here from 2019 where a Canadian official honored Nazi collaborators in Ukraine, angering Jewish groups. And as you said, I think that people do need to understand the context of what happened in World War II and what happened even before World War II in regards to the Ukrainian people. And I think sometimes, like, painting it as Nazi collaborators, sometimes that's true. There certainly was Nazi collaborators, but I think there was also a large segment that were just anti-Soviet. And naturally, like,
yeah.
the enemy of my enemy is my ally. And again, that's where we get into these like strange bedfellows that sometimes come up when you get yourself into, or when you find yourself in extreme situations.
Yeah, we have to, since you talked about this, we have to understand that Ukraine was predominantly fighting on the side of USSR during the World War II against the Nazi. Like predominant, like probably, I don't know percentages, but most of the people who were fighting from Ukraine were on the side of the Red Army of the USSR against the Nazi. But realistically, the ideology of USSR didn't really differ that much from Nazi. So it doesn't change things that much. But Ukrainian Nazi history is just something that Russian propaganda wants to push on you guys. And when you actually look into the statistics of how many people in each European country see Jewish representatives at the parliament as a threat to their nation, you see that the lowest percentage is in Ukraine. There's definitely no hate towards Jewish. There's definitely no, like, I've never experienced, in 23 years, I've never experienced hate towards other nationalities. There are 134 different ethnicities in Ukraine, all coexist happily, speak different languages to each other, doesn't really matter.
Well, yeah. And I think it often comes down to what level you're taking there, right? Like, are we taking a 10,000 foot view? Are we taking like the micro or macro? But appreciate that context.
Oh yeah, you can find a Nazi in Ukraine just like you can find a Nazi in Canada, in US. And does it really change? Like, does it justify the war? It doesn't, right? Like, would the Azov battalion even exist if there's no attack from an outside country? Probably not, because they only started existing as a result of the war, if that makes sense. Do they have 10 to 20% of people who believe in Nazi ideals? maybe there's no proof to that either. Just somebody who said something. That's it.
Well, a spokesperson. So for the Azov battalion. So arguably, like that is a
Former,
bit of a source there. But
a
again,
former
I understand what you're
spokesperson.
saying. So then this from the Ottawa Citizen. And this is one of the ones where, to me, it's always more about the narrative for a lot of politicians in the media versus like the truth. So Canadian officials who met with members of Ukrainian battalion linked to neo-Nazis didn't denounce the unit, but were instead concerned the media would expose details of the get-together, according to newly released documents.
Yeah.
And
And
I
you
think,
just believe this for the face value.
sorry?
You just believe the statement for the face value.
Well, like there was documents released from the Canadian government. I don't know why they
let's
would.
look at the documents. Let's look at the sources. Like realistically, when you dive into it, you can't find any proof besides somebody said something. I tried myself because I was concerned maybe there are Nazis in Ukraine, and
Well,
probably there are
but
some. You know
you
what I
weren't
mean?
even familiar with the quote about 10 to 20%. And I think that that's one of the main statements that you'll regularly see referenced. So,
Yeah, it's pushed by the Russian propaganda for sure.
okay. Then just here another article from the Ottawa Citizen. We won't get into it because I don't think it'll be productive. Rabble.ca passage. And again, this to me is just about trying to
Oh, that's the
highlight.
picture. Yeah, come back there.
Yep.
That's the picture. When you look up the internet for this picture, I don't remember how we do that, but I've seen so many flags instead of the Nazi flag in their hands. Like this is just funny. But
Well, and
you
I
look
guess,
at
like,
this,
do you
you
think the
assume
Roman
this is
salute
true.
here relates to Nazism, or do you view that as something different?
I don't know who these people are even. Honestly, like these all flags can be different flags. Was this picture taken in Ukraine? Was it taken in Russia? Like we just look at this, we assume everything we see is true. And like you're questioning things. You're an example of someone who's questioning things. Most people don't. Now I question even more. Like
Sure, but I guess
I don't
like
see
you're
proof.
like,
You know what I
and
mean?
I don't even blame you for your bias here, but you're very aggressive on questioning anything, even like Canadian source documents or Western media sources.
Dude,
But when it
you,
comes to Ukraine, like you're willing to speak very definitively about it. So
because I have
again,
experience. Just like you have experience with the Freedom Convoy and you speak very definitively about it, don't you? And I'm with you on that.
well,
The
but
exact
like
same experience I have here, you know?
I guess a couple pieces of context. I live in Canada currently during the Freedom Convoy. I was in regular communications with some of their organizers and a lot of the citizen journalists that were reporting on it. I do use a variety of sources as well whenever trying to present anything. So again, I'm not saying that passage here is the ultimate resource. This is just me trying to highlight from RT versus the CBS versus the CNN perspectives there. But again, this to me, like this story about Chrystia Freeland, I don't actually think it's a big deal, but I think the way that they choose to dismiss it ends up becoming a big deal. So the fact that
So
they're like,
let's look at this.
so like
What is
the
happening?
red and black, right? I think has associations with at least ultra nationalists, maybe not exactly Nazis, but the
Yeah,
fact
it has
that
nothing to do with Nazis.
there was this photo taken and they immediately took it down because there was backlash. And they said it was because of a classic KGB disinformation smear accusing Ukrainians and Ukrainian Canadians of being far right extremists or fascists or Nazis. And so I think
I
that,
can talk for that if you want more details. You're like diving deep into this. So the colors black and red have no relation to Nazis. And
but
obviously you
like
can talk
ultra
about things
nationalists would,
different.
or far right, would you say that that's a reasonable association?
Far right definitely use the colors because these colors were used by the Ukrainian, like many times throughout the history of Ukraine, by the Ukrainian army, right? So obviously there are far right wings in almost any country on this planet. There are some in Ukraine, never been popular. Under 2% of people voted to the parliament from that party. So clearly not the majority, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Now,
again, like I think that that's where the nuance in here comes, right? Like
exactly.
the
So even
founder
in
of
this
Azov
picture,
was
I
voted
see
in
nothing
to
here
the
about
Ukrainian
Nazi.
parliament in 2014. He is a neo-Nazi. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone that voted for him was. It easily could be a spectrum of nationalists, right? But at the same time, I do think that that's a little bit different than what we'd see here in Canada. Like, again, that's where to me it's more just about like understand the narratives that are being pushed forward towards us. Where we're constantly told that the number one threat here in Canada is ultra nationalists, far right extremists, and neo Nazis. And I think that falls flat for me. And if you were to tell me that the number one threat in Ukraine was that obviously falls very flat for me, particularly right now with obviously the Russian war. But I think, again, this is where the people that are prone to radicalization are going down conspiracy rabbit hole, rather than Chrystia Freeland being like, yo, look, I shouldn't have been taking a photo with this black and red banner because either it's associated with far right extremism or it would be easily displayed that way by Russian propaganda or whatever. I think that there's a way to have a more honest conversation about this without having to honestly cede any ground to the other side at the same time.
Well,
And I think
the
that,
problem.
sorry,
People don't really want to dive into the details. People assume too many things, including me, including you. Like you look at this two colors and you think it has something to do with neo-Nazis, even though it doesn't. But the media portrayed it that way. So now you think that this particular politician
like,
shouldn't be
again,
taking
I said
pictures of,
ultra
you know what I mean?
nationalists, fascists, or Nazis. And like that, again, these are broad terms that
Very
often
broad.
like,
And there's a huge difference. Like nationalists, people who want to care for their nation, are not neo-Nazis. You know what I mean?
sure, but often when we use that word ultra, it means something a little bit different, right? Like
I don't,
it at a
yeah, I
minimum
don't think
means an
Azov uses
extreme
ultra.
preference for an in group.
Yeah, but it's like you can call me ultra something, even though I don't. Same with like Azov Battalion, for example. People make claims just because it creates the hype. It's not really the case. Most
Well,
likely, I'm
like they
definitely
make
wrong about
claims.
something. I
Azov
want to tell you that.
Battalion spokesperson made the claim. And then
Former
just,
spokesperson,
well,
right?
at the time he was the spokesperson, but yes. CBC News expert warned that Canadian weapons shipped to Ukraine could end up in the wrong hands. Weapons being supplied to Ukraine now could be seized by the Russian military or end up on the black market. And so this is kind of a little bit of a tangent here, but it's just something that I wanted to discuss in regards to this context as well, because again, there are certain aspects of our government that I think constantly want to virtue signal and their actions don't actually back it up. So one thing I was disappointed in was that the Canadian forces confirmed they didn't want to take part in a talk about NATO's discussions underway to try and actually track the arms being brought into Ukraine by NATO and their allies. But anyways, we got through all of it. I really appreciate you making time for this conversation. I hope that actually at the end of the day, people walk away from this with, if nothing else, the opportunity to go down a deeper research hole, right, on this. I think that, again, I'm not saying that, I guess I'm trying to figure out how to summarize all this. So what I really want to try and like give people, at least in regards to my perspective, is I think that both sides of the extreme are incorrect narratives. And
100%.
I honestly hold Western sources to a higher standard than I do RT. Maybe that's unfair or that's like an inherent bias I have, but I think that we can do better as far as media goes here. And I think that we should demand better. And I think that with better reporting, we can actually have like more nuanced conversations, which I hope actually bring people into a more productive frame when discussing this, because I honestly think that there's a segment of individuals that, as we said, like probably believe everything that Russia today puts out. And the reason they're prone to do that is because they see a few examples of hypocrisy in Western media. And while that's maybe drawing a wrong conclusion, I think if Western media was willing to call itself out more often, those individuals would either have a harder time making their arguments, or they might actually be convinced of a more centralist policy or more nuanced take on the situation. So again, that was my ultimate goal with this. I'm totally running late for another meeting because I wasn't necessarily expecting it to take this long, but I really do appreciate you, Andre, just taking the time to go through all this, because again, like I said, you don't speak for all of Ukraine. I don't expect you to be an expert on this. I don't want to claim that I'm an expert on this. I certainly don't speak for anyone on this except for myself. But I do think that even just having conversations like this, if nothing else, I hope that the handful of people that watch this will walk away, even if they don't question their beliefs about Ukraine and Russia, maybe they'll question their beliefs about the next conflict. Because I can remember being very young and hearing about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And I can remember, all the war propaganda that was pushed upon us there. And I want to hold Canada to the highest standard possible. I can't expect that of other countries because I don't participate in them to any meaningful aspect. But again, just wanted to share that with everyone. If you got anything you kind of want to close or wrap up with, definitely feel free to jump in here. But again, just want to say, honestly,
Absolutely.
Thank you for having this conversation.
Thank you, Matt. The only suggestion I can add to that is question everything and think for yourself why certain things become trendy. There's a reason there's a trend about Ukrainian Nazi, and to me, it's just the way to justify Russian aggression. But I suggest looking at the bigger picture first before diving into conspiracy theories and trying to blame the victim of the situation. Realistically, what we're looking at is there's a country aggressor, a terrorist, officially recognized as a terrorist, fairly just destroys another nation for no reason. They can't explain it at this point. They're losing big time on the battlefield, humiliatingly, but they still continue killing the civil population, destroying the infrastructure. People I care about are sitting in basements right now. And instead of looking for ways to stop this permanently and ensure this never happens again, as if we actually care about every human, we look for some deep pockets of neo-Nazi, few percent of the battalion that might have some views that are present everywhere. And Ukraine is probably the country where you find extremists having the least power from any European country. So just a quick summary there. Look at the big picture first. Somebody attacks somebody else. Whatever happens in the response probably wouldn't happen if there's something wrong there, if there was no aggression in the first place, if that makes sense. So my view, based on what I know and what I hear from people on the ground, the only way to permanently stop this is to win Russia on the battlefield. So they cannot continue doing that. There's no compromises that can be made. The only solution is Russia gets out of Ukraine, takes all the troops, pays reparations, rebuilds everything destroyed, so that we can say that international agreements actually work, instead of just being concerned about it.
Awesome. Yeah, again, really appreciate you having this conversation. And I hope everyone keeps doing more due diligence around their natural perspectives. So
yes, question everything.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Matt.
Just want to say a huge thanks again to Andri for spending the time and having this conversation with me. I really appreciate it. He didn't have to spend all this time having this conversation. I'm sure it was very frustrating for him at different periods during the conversation, and I really respect him for having this conversation with me. And hey, maybe down the road, we'll book a much longer time period, and we can have a much bigger topic to discuss, right? Like the entire Ukraine-Russia conflict. Again, I can't imagine that we'd be able to cover that all in one video, but that doesn't mean it's not worth trying. And if you guys watch this all the way to the end, smash the like button, hit subscribe, all that good stuff. But let me know what other topics, what other conversations would you like to see me have in the future, because I want to continuously learn throughout this process.